Whatever happened to Ethel Pinchworthy? Ethel Pinchworthy had never seen an alien. She'd never seen a wallaby either. In fact, she didn't see many people either. She would get visited by her only daughter once every few months. In between those times, she would juggle her time between writing letters to strangers and going into the main town to cause a scene. Both of these actions were aspects of her uniquely bizarre sense of humour. She was in her 70s, and physically not able to run, swim, or wrestle like she used to, but she certainly had all of her mental faculties in order. She merely wrote confusing letters to strangers and shouted at the people in the town to satisfy her warped sense of playfulness. She would walk back from town giggling to herself after an afternoon rant, then sit down in the evening to write a letter of complaint to a complete stranger about their new eyesore outside their house, neither of which she could see from a window situated just outside a town on the other side of the country. She was never bored, but seldom did anything that most people would call normal. The town tolerated her, purely on the belief that she couldn't help her mad, spontaneous outbursts, as she'd lost her marbles. She lived apart from the town, in a remote house a few miles from the preoccupied, busy community nearby. She hadn't lost her marbles, but she was about to have the experience of a lifetime, and her pranks and role-playing in the town would do her no favours for her apparent fantastical storytelling. It all started when an alien spaceship hovered over her house during the twilight hours of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday night. Like all of the best clichés, it was a cloudless sky that became overshadowed by a huge, brightly coloured ship shaped like a bowler hat. It hovered above Ethel's house like a predator with the patience of a watchmaker. It sat above her house, whirring away for a good 90 minutes, as if it was trying to make up its mind about abducting her. Ethel was already sold on the idea, and put on her winter coat, her scarf and flowery bobble hat, and walked outside to wave at the ship above her. "Cooey!" she shouted, waving at whoever was inside the colossal ship. She was met with silence from the visitor. "Hello!" she shouted, this time waving her arms even more vigorously to make it even more likely that they would respond. There was still no response. "Greetings to Earth, Mr. Spaceman!" she shouted eloquently. "My name is Ethel." Her arms were getting tired now. A good rigorous waving session of a few minutes was enough for any person in their 70s, regardless of how enthusiastic they are, to have a visitor. "Oh, bugger the lot of you," she muttered, and turned back to walk into her house. She hadn't gone far before she felt her body lift from the ground. She smiled and giggled with excitement as she looked up and saw there was a light shining around her that seemed to have the power to pull her off the ground and into the direction of the spaceship. It was a slow and steady levitation, and controlled enough so that Ethel remained upright for the whole journey. As she rose to a height that was level to the roof of her house, she waved at it, as if her roof would somehow acknowledge that Ethel was that far off the ground. She continued to smile and made high-pitched noises like "whee" and "woohoo" as she gained a new perspective on the state of her roof and anticipated the aliens that would greet her inside the ship. The hauling of her body into the mouth of the spaceship was so slow that she had time to contemplate what their first words would be to her and what she would want to ask them. She pondered about the state of their ship and if it would need a good clean. She thought about language. Would they be American like her neighbours, or would they be Mongolian? The Mongolians always seemed really nice on the telly, so she was hoping they were a bit like them. Her imagination had time to consider what shape they might be, and if they would be giant beings with booming voices, or tiny creatures with squeaky voices. That last thought made her chuckle. With all that foreboding technology, she hoped they wouldn't be tiny creatures with funny voices. She'd want to jump off. Eventually, after a long, passive ride on a tube of light that led to the spaceship's bottom hatch, the hatch opened up and the light continued to pull her inside. She was still giggling and feeling the side of the ship as she entered. Once she was in, the hatch door slammed shut with an almighty thud, and the silence of the airlock enveloped her upbeat mood. There was no fanfare, No aliens to greet her, not even any flashing lights. Flashing lights were always a good sign of great technology, she thought, and this airlock was very disappointing. Just grey. How could the outside be so inviting and the inside be so uninspiring? When she meets the captain of this ship, she'll have words, she decided. She can give them some ideas on how to greet a stranger. She would have to wait, though. She did, in fact, wait for what felt like hours. It was 20 minutes, but 20 minutes of absolutely nothing. No aliens, no sound, no movement, and, as she was desperate for one at this point, no cup of tea. So after 20 minutes of nothing, the door opposite where she came in slid open, and a metallic egg with wheels whizzed into the airlock. She was shocked to see something else unfamiliar, but very pleased that something had happened finally. The egg stopped a few feet away from Ethel and mechanically grew to her size, expanding from the middle as new compartments gave way to new body parts. It was still shaped like an egg, but now a good few meters tall. "Greetings, Earthling," the egg said, completely unaware of the cliché it was providing. "My name is Mip. I have been programmed to welcome you to the ship and to make sure you're comfortable." "Oh, hello, Mip," Ethel said, now giving herself permission to enjoy the experience again. "Thank you for greeting me." "That's okay, human. I am programmed to do it. If I wasn't, I wouldn't have done." Ethel squinted her eyes at the way a swift pleasantry had been cancelled out. "Fair enough," she resigned. "What is this ship?" "It's a spaceship. It travels across the galaxy and collects information." "Information?" "Indeed. The custodians of the ship will tell you more. You need to let me swallow you and chew you for a bit." "Pardon?" Ethel said, wondering if she'd misheard what Mip had said. "I need to swallow you and chew you for a bit. When I spit you out, you will be able to understand everything they say." "Who?" "The custodians of the ship. They are tremblers." "Tremblers?" Ethel sniggered at the sound of their name. "They tremble." "No, they don't tremble. That's one of your verbs. It doesn't mean the same to them. They are tremblers. It's totally different." "Oh, okay." She tried to contain her amusement, already feeling superior to a bunch of trembling aliens. "So, can you get yourself ready to be swallowed?" the egg asked politely. "What?" "I need to chew you for a bit." "What do you want me to do?" she said, confused and a little worried. "Just pin your arms to your side, hold your breath and hum." "Hum?" "Yes, the humming always distracts your body while I suck it into my translation network." "Okay, what do I hum?" She was willing to go along with this, although it was clearly a leap of faith. "Anything you want." "The Roy Orbison song?" she asked, trying to be receptive. "Who?" "It doesn't matter." She realised Mip wouldn't know, as he'd only just arrived. "I'll hum something random." "Make sure it's good. I don't want to choke on you when you panic." Ethel nodded in agreement, placed her hands by her side and began to hum. It turned out to be very distracting because she managed to hum something that she couldn't pin down. She desperately tried to think of the title of the tune or the artist that released it. Her mind went round and round in circles while she pondered the origin of this tune, while Mip sucked her inside his translation network, chewed her body for a while, and spat her now wet, smelly body out of his bottom end. She staggered up off the floor, wringing wet and saturated with the egg's sticky translation fluids. She felt like he should have told her more about the process, but then decided it was worth picking her battles, and he was just, for all intents and purposes, a butler. "Have you got a towel I can use? I'm all wet." "Of course," the egg said, and produced a small flannel-sized towel from where Ethel had been ejected. "Do you keep a lot of things in there?" she asked facetiously. "Yes," he said coldly. "Oh, there's one more thing," the egg said. Ethel looked up from drying herself from his slime. Without a word of warning, the egg threw a large canvas over her head and pulled her arms through some holes on the sides. Ethel looked down and noticed the bright yellow design of the outfit she had just been fitted and the giraffe pattern scattered around the garment. She looked at the egg, confused. "They love giraffes and they love yellow. You want to give a good impression, right?" Ethel nodded, feeling that no amount of government training would have prepared her for this. With soaked, dishevelled hair and sporting a huge yellow dress with giraffes dotted around it, Ethel was led by her metallic guide through the corridors of the ship and toward the cockpit. The walls of the spaceship were relatively plain, but with various pictures, photographs, sketches and fabric prints of giraffes lining them in each of the corridors they passed. An occasional room was passed, and Ethel couldn't help having a quick look inside them to find out more about her hosts. To her surprise, there were no giraffe pictures, but what she did find was large beds of sugarcane growing in some of the rooms, with other rooms containing elements of the process for turning that sugarcane into sugar. One room had rollers to flatten the cane and separators to process the plant. Another room had the huge evaporator pots that burned the sugarcane fibre to make it into syrup. Ethel was fascinated and slightly perplexed. "Sugar?" she simply asked Mip. "Oh, they love sugar. They probably love sugar more than they love giraffes." "Wow," Ethel nodded, enlightened and intrigued. The last room they passed simply had granulators in them, all with sugar being processed as they passed. Ethel noticed there was nowhere to sleep in these rooms. "Where do the tremblers sleep?" she asked, quite pleased with herself that she'd remembered the alien species name. "They don't." "They don't sleep?" She was understandably puzzled. "They have a fatigue resolution system in their bodies." Fatigue resolution? Ethel loved how much she was learning. As one part of their body continues on in the day, several other parts of the body sleep. It's why you have a conversation with a trembler, and when that conversation takes you somewhere, you have to wake them up to actually move. "Wow," Ethel smiled, liking this idea of a fatigue resolution system. "You could play cards with them, but have to do all the card picking because their arms are asleep." Mip continued to give examples. After about 7 examples, Ethel got the point and started thinking about other things. Mip continued talking while Ethel thought about how privileged she was to be picked for this trip on this spaceship, how special it was, and how unique a picture of extraterrestrial life she was getting. "And you'd end up having to shake it yourself." Mick was finishing explaining one of his examples when Ethel's thoughts returned to her immediate surroundings and his voice became clearer again. The last part of the walk to the cockpit was filled with Mip's whistling. Ethel found this new entertainment amusing and endearing. They were almost at the cockpit. They halted at the door, and Mip turned back to Ethel again. "Okay, before we go in, I need to ask you to remain calm. You haven't seen anything like the tremblers before, so you mustn't get spooked. They will possibly panic and eat you." Ethel was pleased to be warned, but immediately worried about what she was about to face in the next room. If Mip had eyebrows, he would have lifted them in anticipation as he slowly opened the door of the cockpit and jumped inside. "Hello, tremblers!" he shouted, as if instantly developing a different personality. Ethel looked around the doorway, stepped inside and surveyed the enormous ornate room they had just entered. Lights flashed across dashboards across the walls of the room. Wheeled seats dotted those dashboards with enough regularity to avoid too long a journey from one panel of lights to the next. Above the panels of lights, canvas paintings of giraffes gazed at her from the walls. They clearly wanted the pleasure of seeing giraffes in every part of the ship they could. At the front of the cockpit, staring at them with big, wide smiles, were 3 tremblers. They basically looked, to Ethel, like half-size, round, sweaty giraffes. She had never imagined a species that looked so similar to a giraffe, and yet so different. The sweat coming off them was so abundant that the floor they were sitting on was wet with pools of their sweat. As she looked around the room, Ethel could spot the other places in the room the tremblers had been since the last clean. Their voices were piercing and high-pitched. "Hello, Mip!" they replied in unison. "Hello, alien giraffe things!" Ethel attempted to join in, but had a stalled, silent response that brought an unsettled atmosphere. "Right," Mip shouted to reclaim the room. "This is Ethel Pinchworthy. She is the latest specimen that the ship has picked up." He extended his thin metallic left arm in her direction to illustrate who he meant. The trembler on Ethel's right spoke directly to her. "Good afternoon, young woman," he greeted, giving Ethel the pleasantry she needed to relax. "Thank you for bringing me on board," she said humbly. "That's okay. You are the 5th human this week," the trembler in the middle added. "Oh, I thought I was the 1st," Ethel said, revealing her disappointment. The 3 tremblers laughed hysterically. The laughter continued for a few minutes, with the tone of their laughter changing as it lingered. Their sound became higher pitched than it already was, and they became short of breath. Ethel noticed that Mip was beginning to panic as the tremblers started to choke. Mip raced towards them and grabbed a metal baton from one of the brightly lit panels. He used the baton to violently strike all 3 tremblers so they stopped choking, lying in their pool of sweat, unconscious. He turned to Ethel. "Please don't make them laugh again. It's very dangerous." He began to whistle again, aware that there would be at least another 10 minutes before they regained consciousness. Eventually, the tremblers woke up from their baton-induced slumber. "Thank you, Mip," the one in the centre said. "That was a close one." "You are not the only human we have met, young woman," the trembler Ethel's left stated. "You are one of hundreds of humans we have met in the last few months. It's been a very interesting investigation." "How have I not seen you before, then?" Ethel asked, sceptically. "We don't show ourselves," the middle one replied, resisting the urge to giggle at the question. "You were the only person to see our ship, and that was because it was homing in on your heat signature for the energy beam that brought you to the ship," the left trembler elaborated, also reining in his suppressed laughter. Mip listened from the back of the room, now crouching in the corner, painting a giraffe. He'd become an expert at painting giraffes. "Anyway," the middle trembler shouted with an uncharacteristically loud tone, "we need to get on with our business. Young woman, please sit on this chair here." He pointed to the floor in front of him. As if he had willed it to exist, a metal chair appeared in front of him. Ethel had no reason to feel threatened, so sat on the chair as instructed. "Very good," the trembler continued. "You are about to take part in the same survey we have given hundreds of humans before you. Some of them were smaller, some were younger, some were quite frightened. You have nothing to fear. It is simply a data collection exercise." The other 2 tremblers went to the sides of the room and produced pads and writing implements from the removable panels under the dashboards on each side. They gave Ethel a wide choice of material to write on: a pen, a pencil, chalk, and 2 unfamiliar implements that Ethel assumed were from a different planet. Predictably, she chose pen and a paper pad. "Now please answer these questions in any language you like, in however many words that you see fit. We will be using the answers to continue to monitor and look after your human race." Wow, Ethel thought. What a huge responsibility. She braced herself for the questions, aware of the weight on her shoulders. "Okay, first question," the middle trembler began. "Please write down why you like being human." Ethel wasn't expecting that. She hesitated for a moment, having never thought about it before. She wrote down her thoughts on family, friends, and her fondness for her home. She struggled to think of the bigger perspective and avoided defining what human nature was. After a few minutes, she informed the tremblers she was finished and waited for the next question. "Thank you. Question 2, the middle trembler continued on. "Now tell me what you want to remember when you've left us." Ethel realized the implication of this last question. She panicked and wrote down an enormous list that included every memory she could think of and of all the emotions that she associated with those memories. She gulped as she finished that list and looked up at the curious aliens again. "Right, number 3. Now we're getting to the heart of the matter. How many times have you interacted with giraffes?" The middle trembler's tone of voice clearly showed a new level of interest. Ethel struggled to answer, but basically wrote down the amount of time she'd been to a zoo. "Number 4. How much do you like giraffes?" Ethel now felt she was part of an elaborate practical joke. She thought she'd be inventive and wrote a poem about giraffes and how majestic they are. The tremblers seemed to like that a lot. They smiled at each other and hugged, as if they'd just shared a special moment to remember. "Question number 5. How long does a giraffe live for?" Ethel sighed, slightly irritated by the obsession with giraffes. She had no idea, so simply wrote the number 53 down. The tremblers to her left and right looked at each other as if they knew something she didn't, and turned back to the middle alien. He gave her the last question. "Now, young woman of Earth, please take this easel and paintbrush and paint for us a picture of a giraffe in an African landscape. Don't skip any bit of the giraffe and write down its name next to the picture." Ethel was now not so shocked at another question related to giraffes, but never considered herself a particularly good artist. Regardless of this, she followed the instructions given to her by these odd aliens and spent the next 25 minutes painting the best picture she could of a giraffe, surrounded by the African savannah. As she finished the last touches of the landscape, she remembered a fact about giraffes that these obsessive sweatballs might enjoy. "Tremblers, I have a fact for you about giraffes that you might like," Ethel spoke out with an excited tone to her voice. All three reacted with predictable delight. "Oh, please elaborate," the middle trembler asked. Ethel sat back with a smug smile on her face and gave them her amazing fact. "Giraffes give birth standing up." She looked at them with a self-satisfied look on her face. They looked unimpressed and confused. "So do we," the trembler on the right replied. "Don't you?" the left trembler asked. Ethel sighed, muttered under her breath, and handed them the picture of the giraffe. "Thank you, young human person." The middle trembler took the painting from her and looked up to address her robot egg friend, Mip. "Mip, get up, please. We have had the survey from this young woman. She can go now. Please don't forget to wipe her down and settle her back with bits missing." "Absolutely," Mip said, unaware of Ethel's visible shock at the idea of having bits missing. Mip led her out of the cockpit and closed the door behind them, and then he turned to her immediately. "You won't have bodily bits missing. He's talking about your memory." "Sorry, can I just ask, am I having bits of my memory taken away because they wanted to know what I thought about giraffes?" "Essentially, yes," Mip replied with an almost apologetic tone to his voice. "This is ridiculous." Ethel was starting to get agitated now. "It is ridiculous, but I'm assuming when you first started getting brought to the ship by the energy beam, you knew something unusual was going to happen." "Well, I guess." Her voice petered out as she realised it could have been worse. "You need to follow me to the hatchway that you came in, and I will prepare you for the return to Earth." Ethel nodded with a feeling of concern, but now placated by the logic of the half-full glass argument in front of her. Mip opened the door of the hatchway, and once they were both inside, grabbed a large container full of liquid, which he drank in one long gulp. "What are you doing?" Ethel asked. "I'm preparing myself to prepare you," he said cryptically. He started swilling the liquid and belching with such force that the 73-year-old woman next to him lost her balance. Mip was too busy reconfiguring his insides to notice her unsteadiness. Once he was ready, he looked cheerfully at Ethel and clapped his tiny hands together. "So, are you ready?" he said in a joyful, oblivious voice. "For what?" Ethel said, unaware of the specifics. "You understand I have to swallow you again." "You have to what?" She thought that the first time was a one-off experience. "Yes, I have to swallow you to get you mixed up with all that stuff I've just drank. It's like getting cleansed." "What? Then I come out of there again?" She pointed to the egg's bottom. "Yes, of course. After all, we can't have you spreading word about the Tremblers' plans to take all of your giraffes away." "You're taking away our giraffes?" She almost shouted this as she was so stunned. "Exactly. Shocking, isn't it?" Mip nodded, as if she'd proved his point. "Look, I'm a prisoner here, really, so you need to do what you have to do and let me get on with my life." Ethel was anxious to get home, even if they were going to take away the memory of her time on the ship. "Can I ask you one thing, though?" "Of course. I consider you a friend now, at least for the next few minutes anyway." He smiled at her warmly. "Can you be as precise as you can? I have lived a long and fruitful life, and I want to remember as much of it as I can." Mip understood and empathized completely. "I will be very careful. You will not be seriously harmed. You can trust me. Everything that means something to you will remain safely in your mind for your happy, contented future." Less than an hour later, Ethel was back at home, having been dropped off immediately after the cleansing, and sat back, confused, in her front room. Her memory had been completely wiped. She had no idea who she was, or why she was sitting in this house by herself. There was no memory of the Tremblers, no memory of her mechanical egg friend, and no memory of why she has no memory now. She had lived a fruitful life, and all of those relationships, all those life-affirming trips away, and all of those pranks she acted out in the town were part of someone else's memory now. The liquid that Mipp had swallowed and mixed with her body before leaving was far more powerful than he had given it credit, and in fact he was far less able to control the effect than he had thought too. Ethel was so excited by the appearance of the spaceship above her house earlier that night, but was sadly now another victim of its data collection. She was found a fortnight later by a friend of hers who sometimes dropped by for a cup of tea. The front door was wide open, and the house was in serious disarray. It was apparent that Ethel had experienced some kind of breakdown and neglected the house for a while. In fact, her friend was more concerned that she had neglected herself for that long too. She called an ambulance and the family doctor, and they took Ethel away to be examined and assessed. Ethel couldn't recall anything. Her name, where she lived, nothing came to her. She was taken to a home for the elderly and looked after. To this day, nobody really knows what happened to Ethel Pinchworthy. More controversially, nobody understands what happened to the giraffes.